Cool. Well, Rory, I appreciate you just, this is the thing about you, right? I listen to so many podcasts with you, and it's a fascinating because you are an example of once you see it or once you gain access to it, the world is never the same again. And it's fascinating because you describe like, okay, if you have an electric car, you're suddenly going to be transformed and you're never going to look at the world the same way again. But what I noticed was that happened for you in when I consumed your talks, your ideas. I said, wow, I can't look at the world the same way. So in essence, you are the very thing you describe with some of these items. And it's just fascinating.
Yeah. I think, by the way, with the electric car thing, I think I'm right in that my hunch was that it doesn't really matter how quickly the market grows. The question is, does anybody who goes electric go back or want to go back? And the last data I saw showed that only 1% of people actually wanted to go back. Now, some of that is probably, to be honest, going to be kind of sunk cost. You know, I've made this huge effort to learn how to charge the bastard. You know, I've worked out where my local charging places are. I've invested a whole load of time in working out how this interface works on my new Tesla. I'm not going to throw away all that sunk cost effort by going, nope, I'm going back to a gasoline car.
Right.
But, I mean, so quite a bit of it may well be sunk cost bias rather than absolutely rational preference. But nonetheless, even if it is sunk cost bias, it will still manifest itself with people who've had electric cars will stick with electric cars.
Yeah. But do you agree with my assessment about you as a person?
Yeah. I'm always really, really interested in things which once unseen can't be unseen. I'm always interested in those things which are obvious in retrospect, but which I think it gets more interesting as you get older too, because now I'm 56. I can still remember, a time before Starbucks. I can remember a time before mobile phones. I can remember a time before the internet. And I can remember, by the way, a time when all three of those things were basically declared to be stupid and kind of a flash in the pan, or, you know, it's just a craze. Yeah. You know, I can remember people denigrating the internet in the very early days, and saying it's CB radio for the 1990s. You don't know what CB radio is?
No.
You do, actually, probably do. Okay, it was a huge craze, I would guess, in the late 70s, early 80s, which was particularly popular with truckers, if ever you've seen the film Convoy. And CB, or Citizens Band Radio, was technically, I think, illegal in Britain, but it was legal in the United States. And it was a way that truckers used to talk to each other, and they would have this particular argot like 10-4 good buddy, and they'd, you know, warn each other of cops, tell each other where was a good place to eat, and truckers would just generally chat with each other, and members of the public then bought CB radios for their cars, and people sometimes had them in their homes to chat to passing truckers, including in the village where I grew up, a well-known local prostitute, but I won't go into that anymore. It was a small village, and this was apparently a valuable source of business. But it was it was a fad, which again, it came and it more or less went. I mean, conceivably, you could develop an app which would actually bring it back, which was quite interesting, which would involve effectively, I suppose you'd have to have geofencing combined with something a little bit like Club Room, okay? And that gives you a vague idea of what it was like. But it was a famous fad in that, you know, for 2 years everybody talked about it, and then everybody sort of lost interest. Like, fantastically, of course, Second Life, which was like
Second
that,
Life?
which was the most. Oh, you know, right? Okay, Second Life was this early attempt at, before there was Moblocks and before there was Minecraft, there was this. I think it was before, anyway. There was this thing where you could basically create a virtual universe and wander around making uncoordinated movements and bumping into strangers. And it was effectively, it was an early stab at the metaverse, which became unbelievably exciting. I mean, ad agencies talked about nothing else for about 8 months, and then it disappeared.
What year?
Now, of course... Bloody hell, now you're asking me. It's quite a surprisingly long time ago. Right, okay. So Second Life launched. Here we go. Let's look at the usage stats, because there was 1 year where it peaked. 70 million accounts. Currently, it has 200,000 users. Here we are. Is Second Life still a thing? Second Life usage statistics since launch. That'll be it. Hello. Curious as to... this might be an infographic. Here we go. It was produced by Linden Labs, as I remember. Oh, bloody hell. 10 years of Second Life.
It looks like 2002 was the first year.
I think it was 2003.
2003, yes.
2003, I think, because the 15th anniversary. And it was undoubtedly a precursor to the metaverse, however you want to call it.
Wow, that's fascinating. Talking about the metaverse in 2003.
But the interesting thing is 57 million accounts have been created in total. A total time of 482,000 years users have spent in the place. There are still... I mean, it's still existing, in fairness. But the interesting thing is that if you talked about it now, people would think you were nuts. 1.2. Yeah, God, it's as old as that, is it? My goodness.
That's something that happens a lot when people grow up. We say, like, wow, I can't believe that was 10 years ago. And I'm sure you've experienced that a lot. It's like, it feels as if things that happened in the past happened sooner than they actually occurred.
Yeah, no, they become completely telescoped, don't they? Things in the past.
Yeah.
So someone said it's very hard. We have a very strange view of perspective in terms of time. And someone gave a few examples. For example, pointing out, I think, that ABBA's first hit song "Waterloo," I can date this, which would have been the early 70s, was much, much closer to the end of the Second World War than it is to the present day,
yes.
For example. So, okay, which is a really good question, what on earth year that would have been. But it's, you're absolutely right. It was initially released in June the 23rd, 2003, which seems almost freaky to me, because if you'd asked me to guess, I would have guessed something like 2009.
Wow. We often
how weird is that?
We often do that.
The weirdest, there are a few really weird ones about time, which I like. Sharks are older than trees. So there were sharks basically drifting around in the oceans before there were trees on land.
That's wild.
Okay, what the hell, right? That's completely wild. Okay. And the other one is that when you see Antony and Cleopatra standing in front of the pyramids in, Cecil B. DeMille or whatever it may be, okay, they were, let me get this right, closer in time to us than they were to the building of the pyramids. Which is kind of like, what? Okay. So actually the pyramids then were as much ancient history to them, the building of the pyramids, as Antony and Cleopatra are to us now in 2022, sorry, get it right. Yeah, we've been looking at too many dates here. But no, that Second Life thing has totally weirded me out now, because I definitely would have placed it about 8 years later.
But it's possible perhaps that you found out about it 8 years later. Like,
yeah, no. That's a very good question. When did it actually become big? Really good question. I think it became big fairly quickly. Crikey. There's no objective. Second, they created avatars. They explored a world known as the grid. Yes, in 2005 and 2006, it received massive media attention, including a cover story in Business Week magazine. So you're right, it wasn't absolutely that. I think 2008, the maximum concurrency, in other words, the number of avatars in world at the same time was 88,200 in the first quarter of 2009. But I think, to be honest, it was probably, and we got an interesting question here, it probably suffered the same problem as MySpace did before Facebook, which was it was too disorderly. And there's a kind of optimal level of fascism, I think, in those social spaces where people need a certain number of constraints. Otherwise, they're simply blinded by the headlights and they don't know what to do. And if you can choose, any body shape for yourself, and you can build a house out of anything, it's basically too many goddamn choices and people end up doing nothing. And Twitter, of course, enjoyed, the great advantage of it's absolutely clear what you do. It's what Don Norman in his book, The Design of Everyday Things, would call a very clear single affordance.
Yes.
You pick up this thing, I see that's what it's for, right, I get it. Okay, either I want to do that thing or I don't want to do that thing.
Yeah.
That's fine. If you don't want to do that thing, don't do it. But if you do want to do that thing, you know what to do.
I was just reading your chapter last night on this, and
right,
and how the Walkman was originally supposed to have a record button, but they didn't have the record button because it would have let people know there's too much here. I don't know what exactly to do.
No. So people would have. Now, interestingly, it did have a little microphone, the first one, so that people could talk to you while you're wearing your headphones. But Akio Morita apparently vetoed the record button, even though it would have cost only cents to add the functionality, because the actual platform of the original Walkman was based on a dictaphone, effectively.
Yeah.
Which is.
What's a dictaphone?
Which is a thing with a cassette. Right. Okay. So if you wanted to dictate. Because this is really interesting, because in 1986, say, it was beneath the dignity of most senior executives, mostly male, to type, okay? I mean that, okay? So both me and my wife, who preferred typing, was slightly told off when we first entered the workplace for effectively, if the PA or secretary left the room, we'd sneak over to the word processor so we could actually type something rather than handwriting it and then handing the handwritten paper over to a typist to type. Before I arrived at Ogilvy, there was a thing called the typing pool. And everybody wrote things, passed them down to a typing pool where they were typed up, and then they were sent back for you to send. I mean, whack, okay? But, I mean, completely whack when you look back on it. But we were slightly told off, basically the idea of tapping away on a keyboard, until the spreadsheet came along, until Excel 123 was invented, most senior business people wouldn't have had a keyboard anywhere near their desk. The spreadsheet, which required constant interaction, suddenly made a case for people to have some sort of screen and keyboard on their desk. But everything that involved a keyboard was secretarial, and therefore, if you're an executive, what are you doing performing a secretarial function by typing? Okay?
Yeah.
Now, people who are either on the move or who wanted to show off, or who had, for example, a long commute or drove, rather than handwriting letters to be sent and typed up by their PA, would dictate them. And the PA would effectively then sit there with a very small cassette tape. It was like a miniature cassette tape designed to fit in a portable dictaphone, which with a couple of AA batteries probably, a couple of AA batteries would sit in your shirt pocket or your jacket pocket. And you'd take it out and say, take dictation, Miss Lemon, to Mr. John so-and-so at, J. Walter Thompson Company, blah, 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 40 Berkeley Square. Dear John, it was wonderful to see you last so-and-so, blah, 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 best wishes to you and the kids, yours so-and-so. And then what would happen is when you got in from your train journey or your business trip, you'd hand this cassette. I'm not making this up.
It sounds so inefficient.
You'd hand this cassette. It was totally bizarre. I mean, when you think about it, the typewriter was kind of ridiculous because not the word processor, which obviously in things like legal documents saved a huge amount of replication, but the typewriter, even with carbon paper, okay, where you made 2 or 3 multiple copies, or with the Gestetner machine. When I was at Cambridge in the 1980s, there was a very rich guy there called Gestetner, whose grandfather or something had patented this big drum where you basically type things and ran out copies with a great big rotating drum. And anyway, sorry, but the bizarre thing about the typewriter was, okay, it made business correspondence look more professional and it made it a lot easier to read, but it meant every goddamn thing had to be written twice.
Yeah.
Now, the only thing about it which was beneficial, which we probably didn't notice, was it did impose a filter, a kind of invisible filter on who got to dominate printed material. Because, first of all, the more junior you were, the longer it took you to get anything typed. Okay? And therefore, a junior person might only be able to get out, letters fairly infrequently. Senior people will get stuff typed straight away, and they get it distributed straight away. And so senior people had more communicating power than junior people, which probably acted as an undemocratic but slightly useful filter on the volume of material. Because if you saw something that had been sent to you that had been typed, someone had it was either from a senior person or a junior person had sacrificed, considerable favours with the typing pool to get it produced, which suggested it was quite important. And people who worked at Ogilvy in the 1960s and 70s said that if you're a junior person at Ogilvy, you had to go down and kind of spend half an hour a day George Clooneying the typing pool. Okay? Hello, how are you, gorgeous creature? And you'd have to do this sort of nonsensical flirtation, because if you didn't keep them sweet and on side, your life wasn't worth living, because you couldn't actually produce anything.
Did that ever happen to you, where the typing pool went off?
The typing pool had... The typing pool had long since disappeared when I joined.
Gotcha.
When I say long since, it had probably only gone for about 4 years or so. And it had been replaced, rather than with a pool which was centralised. You had, each PA would probably have had a word processor on the desk. This is pre-laptop for the most part. There was a laptop in Ogilvy. One senior copywriter had one to take on shoots with him. And it was a thing which basically all you could do was type on the bloody thing. It weighed as much as a suitcase, and it cost, at least in modern money, something like $15,000.
Wow.
So the senior copywriter came back into Ogilvy about 5-10 years ago and said, you might like this. And it was this extraordinary thing which would have been absolutely mind-blowing in its day. It was it was the price of a car, right? And basically all you could do was, type notes on it. It was probably less potent in computing power than a very, very earlier Nokia, mobile phone.
Right.
Much less, actually, come to think of it. But it was all there was in 1983 or whatever it was when this guy had it. And but what's interesting about being old is you do have a better chronological sense of perspective in terms of you've also seen weird things like QR codes become fashionable, become completely ridiculed, and then suddenly find a completely new life because of a pandemic.
Yeah.
And actually, video conferencing is fascinating because it's been the future for pretty much... people have been preaching video conferencing or believed it was the future really since the 1980s or 90s. Star Trek had it, obviously, if you think about it. Admittedly, it was highly centralised with a big screen, and Lieutenant Uhuru, I think, controlled the graphics, if I'm right. Okay, so they clearly had a kind of hybrid meeting model rather than a remote model, because you communicated to the bridge. But Star Trek had this video communication thing, and every single telco, every single mobile phone company believed it was the future, and then it spent so long going nowhere. Okay, it spent so long going nowhere that people just stopped believing in it. They just thought there must be some good reason why it hasn't taken off. Suddenly you have a pandemic, everything changes. Weirder still, I'm just thinking of, a guy came to me, senior guy from Nokia, this would have been round about 2009, and he was talking to me about the early experiments they had, not about watching films on your TV, because there was nowhere near enough bandwidth then, but they thought there was a way to broadcast TV to your mobile phone so that you would watch moving video on the mobile phone. And I must admit, I remember thinking, who the hell would want to do that? I mean, bear in mind, I was not a Luddite. I mean, I had friends who didn't want mobile phones. You know, these are sophisticated people. All of them have mobile phones now, obviously. But I had a significant body of friends who said, no, it's far too expensive, and why do I want to make phone calls on the street?
Yeah.
They eventually, if in a sense, became bullied into getting mobile phones, even if they didn't want them, because, you know, by the point where 70% of people had mobile phones, if you didn't have one, you're just a part of the awkward squad. And also, you're a pain in the arse to make arrangements with,
right.
you see. Because with everybody else, you'd say, look, I'll find a decent pub in Covent Garden and I'll ring you around about 6, you see. But the non-mobile phone owners, you couldn't do that with, and you had to go and get in touch with them, pre-arranged shit. And you'd say, you thought, I was solid, I won't bother inviting the Luddite tosses, you know. And so eventually, you know, you kind of had to join in. To be honest, I think a lot of people didn't really want smartphones, but phones just became smart whether you wanted it or not.
Where would you put yourself on the curve of, you know, there's like a popular meme of like early adopter to like late, and it's a percentage with like, let's say 0% is an early adopter, like the first percentile.
Oh,
where would you rank yourself?
Okay, so I'm conscious of the fact that I'm an early adopter and hence not representative of the population, and hence I'm conscious of the fact that I will get excited by many technologies which never make that leap.
Yeah.
You know, in other words, what is it called? There's the Bass diffusion curve, which is one model of tech adoption, which is basically just a kind of sigmoid curve. But there's also the idea of crossing the chasm, isn't there?
Yeah.
That there are certain products that get trapped, that fail to cross the chasm. They get trapped in the early adopter mode among people who just are obsessed with trying new shit. And they never actually make that journey to normalization or widespread social acceptance. Now, I think, I'll be interested to know if you've heard of this, I think the air fryer has finally perhaps crossed the chasm.
I've heard of the air fryer, yeah.
I spent a long time preaching the air fryer,
yeah.
and people going, yeah, it's fucking Rory with his bloody air fryer. And I was right. And I think during lockdown in particular, and just because of a variety of concatenation of circumstances, the air fryer has finally, you know, leapt across that chasm to, roughly speaking, mainstream acceptance. And I think, you know, the electric car, let's admit it, is still in early adopter territory, except probably in a country like Norway or somewhere really interesting, where they had massive subsidies for electric cars, despite the fact they're a massive oil and gas producer. But anyway, go figure. And but except Norway is probably, you might say, the electric car is now fully normalised. But in most cases, it's still. So I'm still an early adopter. My grandmother, to some extent, my father actually, were both early adopters. My he's still alive, so I've got to be careful. He's 92, okay? But he's quite stingy, my dad. But he would occasionally go and splurge on something new and exciting. You know, he'd come back with a sort of $300 sleeping bag, you know, of some extraordinary construction. And he nearly bought, you probably don't know what this is, the Sinclair C5, which is a kind of electric-powered little road vehicle, which I suppose was a precursor to the electric tricycle, really. It was ahead of its time. Again, I mean, Sinclair was fundamentally right, I think, that the world needs a kind of e-bike. The e-bike's a very interesting technology, by the way, because as a fat guy, it might actually get me into cycling, which wouldn't be a bad thing. But also it makes cycling a lot more mainstream, I think. It makes it potentially more mainstream.
So...
But if you take an example of my grandmother owned this is a terrible claim to fame, but they were the 4th family in Wales to own a dishwasher.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Now, Wales has a population of about 3.5 million people, so having dishwasher number 4 is fairly good evidence of early adoption.
Yeah. Well, on the point of the electric bike, I think there's a big problem with it because
Go on. I'd love to discuss this because
you don't...
Go on, hit me.
Yeah, you don't earn the force you create. And so it gives you a false sense of belief that you can go faster than you actually can. When you pedal really hard and you know how fast you're going because you created the force yourself. But the electric bike almost acts as a way to get force that you didn't earn yourself, so you don't know how fast you're going. Therefore, you're more likely to crash.
That is interesting, because my hunch is that it requires quite a lot. Now, there are a few upsides, I think. Okay, one of which is that you can take. I've just written a piece for The Spectator. One of the reasons cyclists tend to be quite rude road users is that they physically pay the price of losing momentum. Okay, yeah. So if you stop at a traffic light, rather than dipping onto the pavement and scooting through, you've just lost hard-won 30 miles an hour of accumulated kinetic energy, okay? Now, if you can do the right thing, stop at the traffic lights and let the battery speed you back up to 20, I think it's 15.5 miles an hour in the UK and 20 miles an hour in the United States. I've been doing my research. For one thing, it will make you a bit happier slowing down. It'll make you much happier on hills. Because let's be honest, even unless you're a Tour de France style cyclist, even pretty good cyclists are really slow going uphill. To the point where sometimes it's barely any faster than walking, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I've seen cyclists with, they've got all the flaming lycra and the bloody, the 7-speed Shimano gears and the titanium, but they're going uphill basically at a pretty glacial pace, right, on some low gear, right? So the third thing is you can put some of the extra energy that comes from the battery into things that are less efficient but more comfortable. So big fat tires, right? I mean, driving in an urban environment with those very thin tyres, I imagine, one, it's quite uncomfortable, but two, because you've got to have a high pressure on the tyre. Secondly, I think it requires a lot of concentration, because one slight flaw in the road surface and it could basically lob you off, or one badly judged curb mounting and you could end up with a bit of a crisis. Whereas if you put the extra battery power into slightly lower pressure, chunky tyres, you can even have things like, you can have fenders, let's be honest, okay? The reason bikes have so little protective equipment is because if you added protective equipment to a bike conventionally, it would make it slow. Whereas if you can still go 20 miles an hour with protective equipment, I don't know. And also really bright lights might be another feature of having a powerful battery. So some of the waste energy, but I agree with you that I suspect, when I first test drove an electric car, it was so goddamn quiet. I took it out on the M25 and it was the Jaguar I-Pace I actually test drove. And I went, whoa, God, this acceleration is astonishing. Oh my goodness, this is amazing, And then I was, driving along after I'd done the acceleration test, in annoyance of my wife, okay? And I went to say, but shit, I'm going 108 miles an hour. I'd lose my license if I got... Okay? So undoubtedly, it takes a bit of mastery. The only thing I will say is that having had... Oh, I'm sorry, my wife's just ringing out. Can I just pause for a second?
Absolutely.
So to go back to the electric car phenomenon, when I first had an electric car, for the first brief period, you drive it like a bloody idiot. Because the acceleration is so fascinating. It's very, very torquey, particularly at the high end and blah, 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 blah. To be honest, now, about 1% of the time when I need to, I drive it like a go-kart. And the rest of the time, I drive like a Quaker. And part of the reason is that you have no sense of resentment when you're forced to slow down because of regenerative braking. And because I actually practice this thing, which you can all... I don't think the Tesla actually has it, but it has a similar thing, high regen. With other cars, it's called one-pedal driving, where basically if you take your foot off the accelerator, the engine does all the braking for you and regenerates most of the power back into the battery. And when you have one-pedal driving on, you become surprisingly unresentful if you have to slow down for somebody else. Or if a set of traffic lights forces you to go red. You just go, I'll, pop some of the energy back in the battery, and then I'll accelerate away again. So you don't feel that sense that you've been robbed of your kinetic energy by someone who makes a bit of a gaff of a left turn or something.
Yeah.
So it does change your driving style. It's very interesting because we had a very interesting discussion about this. Quite a lot of countries campaigned. They campaigned to stop sat-navs putting estimated arrival time on the sat-nav because they thought it would encourage people to kind of drive more competitively. In other words, if you thought, oh God, I was going to arrive at 1:30 and now it says 1:35, I'm going to have to welly it to catch up my time.
Right.
Okay. Or that people would be made particularly conscious of the fact they were running late and would therefore, overcompensate, if you like, by driving too fast. Now, I can't speak for anybody else. I mean, it may be true that this happens. On the other hand, quite a lot of the time, the sat-nav gives me confidence that I'm going to arrive on time. It says, okay, your meeting's at 1:30. According to this sat-nav, you're going to arrive at 1:17. So you can now chill a bit. There's no need to panic. When otherwise I might have actually been in a screaming hurry simply out of uncertainty. Okay? The second thing that the sat-nav taught me was that whereas there's obviously a big difference between going 50 miles an hour and 30 miles an hour, and there's a huge difference between going 30 miles an hour and being in stationary traffic, the difference between going 60 and 80 on a interstate, as you'd call it, okay, is basically trivial. Mm-hmm. And there's I think it's an Israeli designer who's created a thing called the paceometer, which is a speedometer which doesn't just show miles per hour, it also shows minutes per 10 miles. So obviously at 60 miles an hour, you'll do, it'll take you 10 minutes to go 10 miles. And at 80 miles an hour, it only reduces that by a minute and a half or something. Whereas obviously at 10 miles an hour, it will take you 60 minutes, okay, to go 10 miles, which is pretty dismal. And what's interesting about the paceometer is that you realise that although 80 feels a lot faster than 60, and you feel you're making a hell of a lot more progress because it feels faster, actually in terms of time saving, it's a waste of time. That actually you can make rather than driving at 70 miles an hour for 50 miles down an interstate, just remember to have a pee before you leave the house, and that'll make as much difference to your arrival time. That actually the gains you get from going silly fast rather than sensible fast are actually basically not worth having. Yeah. Because you end up putting yourself through a lot of stress, you put other people and yourself through a certain degree of danger, and the amount of time saved is not worth having.
This is something Derek Sivers wrote about, are you familiar with Derek Sivers?
I know, but I need to know him, because it sounds, anybody who writes about this is a man of my own heart.
Yeah, so Derek Sivers, incredible entrepreneur and writer, and he wrote this great blog post about how he would do a boardwalk bike every week, and he timed himself and he saw it was 45 minutes. And then he decided to go really fast, and he realized he did the same bike ride in 42 minutes. And he said, yeah, all that huffing and puffing for 3 extra minutes, why don't I just enjoy the ride? And if you extrapolate that to life in general, is like, you see so often people huffing and puffing.
You could make the same point about wealth, I think.
Interesting.
And I've encountered, now it's easy for me to say this because statistically, okay, I'm quite rich. I'm not rich in the sense of assets or capital accumulation, particularly, but in terms of income and disposable income, right? I am. But the one thing I have noticed, I have come into contact with people who are so preoccupied with wealth accumulation that they forget to enjoy the ride. And, that strikes me as, fundamentally a philosophical failing. I don't think it's that many people. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think having, although, funnily enough, as you get older, life gets a lot cheaper because you know what you like. Yeah. That's one of the interesting things. I mean, one of the reasons it's expensive being young is you actually have to find out what you enjoy, and so... And I think naturally we become a bit more conservative in our tastes as we get older too. So that's why I have been an early adopter. I still am an early adopter. By the standards of 56-year-old, I'm probably an extreme early adopter, an experimenter. But at the same time, I do feel myself losing slightly that puppy dog enthusiasm for absolutely everything new. I tend to go, look, before we start talking about the metaverse, let's crack video calling, right? Because there's scope for a whole heap of hardware here. Nikon should be making video calling hardware. Definitely. That actually, is because look, I don't know what the quality of the video you're receiving is, but I'm recording this on a mirrorless Sony ZV-1, I think it is, rigged up as a webcam with a Rode microphone. I always wear, you're wearing headphones as well. I can't do video conferencing without headphones because it lacks the immersion.
Yes.
And I always say to other people, what are you doing? What are you doing not wearing headphones? You can't do a video call without headphones.
Really puts you in the seat.
Because it's got to transport you, you know, somehow. And so I'm really, I think there's a whole amount of work to be done on actually particularly cracking hybrid models and cracking video conferencing. There's a device, by the way, which I'm going to plug shamelessly. Not that Facebook really needs free publicity. Maybe it needs free good publicity, I suppose. Which is the Facebook Portal TV, which you can probably find for $99 if you wait for an Amazon sale day. If you're feeling flush, it's $149. And this is a device that plugs into your TV and has Zoom capability, WhatsApp and Messenger video capability. I think it's also got one. They're going to add Teams capability to it, or so they claim. Anyway, and I have to say of this bloody thing, it's incredibly good.
Interesting.
I mean, it's a $500 piece of AI-driven, face tracking technology, which means you can chat to your relatives on a 55-inch 4K screen. Probably it's in HD, to be honest, not 4K. I don't know, but I mean, this, if you'd shown it to people in the 1980s, they would have thought was a miracle.
Yeah.
And you can buy the goddamn thing for $99 and no one's excited. I mean, this is where I do feel that there's a lot of misdirected attention, actually. I think also, I think there are also a lot of technologies of which blockchain will be one, which is the real task is to make it comprehensible to people. Mm-hmm. It's not to go around evangelizing it with strange groups of Austrian school economists or, people who think we should be back on the gold standard. If you want blockchain to really get widespread adoption, you've got to find something that people find useful.
Yeah.
Jobs to be done, to quote Clay Christensen.
And be able to explain it to my parents or grandparents. But
yeah,
on the topic of social networks, Elon Musk is buying Twitter. I have to bring this up to you. What is your perspective?
What's the latest news on that? Have they put in some sort of block?
Joe Rogan shared some Twitter post of a New York Post article where it said Elon Musk is in the final hour of buying Twitter, and it looks like it's a done deal, according to the New York Post. So what's your perspective on that?
Well, first of all, I think Twitter has made some egregious mistakes in terms of who they banned. Mm. And I also worry that there is this question, which is I've had friends who are banned through complete nonsense. Okay. So in other words, someone had a dud old Twitter account, which they hadn't had for ages, but it was linked to 3 other Twitter accounts. There was nothing nefarious about this. They weren't sock puppeting. It was just they had a business Twitter account under a different name, which they used for tweets in one area of discussion, and then they had another Twitter account, which they used for like personal chit-chat, okay?
Right.
Early business account goes dormant. Someone hacks into it, starts basically publishing garbage. They were basically kicked off Twitter. All their accounts were shut, okay? And I had to put them in touch with someone I knew who used to work at Twitter who said, don't tell him that I put you this way, but this is the guy you have to contact. And please don't say I said this was the guy to contact.
It's like a dark web.
He hates me. And it's like, so I had to exercise like really weird, nefarious contacts to get this guy reinstated. Now, this is something we need to be really alert to with these huge organizations, okay? Unless they have really strong principles of judgment. I had a really weird experience with Amazon, and I still can't explain this, okay? But Amazon, despite the fact that I pay for Amazon Prime, suddenly started deciding that it would only deliver to me on a Monday, a Friday, and a Sunday. Right? So it didn't matter. If I went in on Monday evening and said, oh, I'd like to buy this thing. Oh, it's Amazon Prime. It would say, have it on Friday. Okay, well, that's no shitting good. I mean, the whole point I'm paying for Prime is next day delivery. Right. Oh, a Friday. And then, on Thursday, I could get it delivered on Friday. And on Friday, I could get it delivered on Sunday. I think, okay. But then if I change the address, if I ordered something for a friend as a present in some completely remote area of the UK. Oh no, next day delivery was fine.
Wow.
And I was just being persecuted with these 3 delivery days.
It's so
it was
funny.
Some sort of software glitch.
No, it's so funny that
go on.
you describe it as a persecution because, 10 years ago, if I said to you, you're going to get this package in 4 days.
I know.
You'd be like, this is incredible. But I know you noticed that and realize that. But it's funny how once we get accustomed to something.
No. I mean, we become entitled to things ridiculous. There's a wonderful Louis C.K. Sketch about that, where he talks about the man who can't get Wi-Fi on the plane.
Yes,
he goes, this is bullshit. This is bullshit. And he's sitting there, he didn't even know that plane Wi-Fi was available 20 minutes beforehand.
Yeah.
And now he's going, this is just bullshit. Right? Anyway, as he said, you're communicating up in space. You probably are actually on a plane, aren't you? It's probably satellite based. So anyway, the extraordinary thing was, I contacted various people on Amazon and said, why is it my address? I can send presents to people. I can get deliveries to people next door to me tomorrow. But when it's my address, it's only 3 days a week. Nobody had a clue. Okay.
Wow.
And then eventually I went into myself and I dicked around with rewriting my address. Okay. So I started writing my address in stupid ways, like in the wrong order, but so that it was still comprehensible to a delivery person. And eventually it popped back to normal.
Wow.
And I could get 7 days a week, next day delivery. But it occurred to me that the only guy who probably knew how to fix that was based in Seattle, 5,000 miles away from me, okay, and had probably got $4 million of Amazon shares vested. So the last concern of his was likely to be sorting out some limeys problem with next day delivery, on the other side of the goddamn planet, okay? And so the extent to which we're creating invisible bureaucracies, I thought Twitter was way out of line banning Trump, right?
I agree.
Because it was emphatically not clear. Whatever you think of Trump, it was emphatically a topic of debate whether he had incited violence, okay? I'm a Brit anyway, so I didn't even accept what happened. And, for some reason, when you did it in 1776, you overthrew a legitimate government. That's perfectly fine, right? Okay, completely legitimate government there. And you overthrow the thing, that's wonderful. They're all heroes. But when a bunch of people in weird horns do it, no, you can't have that. Anyway, so I didn't even accept the legitimacy of the government to begin with, obviously. But parking on that, it was not clear whether Trump had incited violence or not. And lots of people, lots of lawyers could have argued about it. And he was, for God's sake, the elected representative of 300 million people, whether you don't, even if you hate the guy, right?
Right. Okay.
And that was kind of a spiteful and weird thing to do, which I think brought them into discredit, personally, because it's patently clear they've been far more indulgent about other people whose language and general tonality has been far more contentious than that.
Yeah.
And so I see what Musk is up to, because he might be arguing that unless you have this completely free speech question, I mean, he's a wonderfully polarizing character, isn't he?
Yeah. You described him as a huckster in another podcast, but meant it as a good thing. No. As a good thing.
No, I mean, I think that's the important point, by the way, which is that all those guys, Edison, Watt, undoubtedly Henry Ford, actually, although we always think of him as a puritanical figure, but actually, he did a huge amount of publicity around car racing. Okay, they're all salesmen.
Yeah.
This idea that they're inventors. There are lots of inventors, but an inventor salesman and Musk and Jobs both have this extraordinary facility, which actually slightly annoys me.
Why?
To create this reality distortion field. Well, because their fan base people are so... I go on YouTube, and I'm not very interested in electric cars. I don't have a Tesla. I've got a Mustang Mach-E, which I love. Absolutely love the thing, okay? But I really like the Tesla. I respect the guy, okay? But I don't quite see why both Apple and Tesla when they introduce a new product, it's a national news event.
Interesting.
Whereas when Ford introduces a Mustang, or when, for that matter, Hyundai or another electric car manufacturer introduces a pretty significant electric car, that's not newsworthy in the same way.
The power of a personal brand. The reason why is because Musk and Jobs have fan bases personally that people connect to them. Whereas if you tell me who's the Ford CEO, I have no idea who it is. So I don't care as much as I do about somebody who has the personal brand.
No, and we always had Richard Branson had it, for example, in the UK. The personal brand is very important because you do feel there's a guy there, behind the scenes who's kind of, got your back. And actually, I was talking to a neuroscientist the other day who said that when you look at Apple, it's extraordinary. The main thing that Samsung loyalists have is just not wanting to be an Apple loyalist. And I think there's a whole market for electric cars for people who just can't quite buy into the whole Tesla cult.
Yes.
It's the Reformation, okay, I get it. It's the one holy and apostolic church or whatever, but
the new religion is Tesla and Apple.
And when you get these people on YouTube, and basically every day there's a YouTube film which goes, the latest fart from Elon Musk changes everything.
I just stumbled upon a YouTube channel that's got 500,000 subscribers. All it does is cover Elon Musk's latest happenings. And I thought, this is crazy, incredible, and absurd at the same time.
But I have to admit, I really like the guy. And let's face it, I mean, before, there were a whole bunch of, 19th and 18th century Britain was full of these extraordinary lunatics who were, in some cases, highly disagreeable people or very strange people or whatever, but who were just, I guess the steam engine. I love the huckster story of James Watt, who invented the horsepower as a unit of power to sell steam engines to mines. Because all the mine owner wanted to know is how many horses does it replace, right? He wasn't interested in, cylinder size or calorific power or any of the, you could talk to him about engineering. The mine owner would basically just drift off into a daze, okay? So you basically said, okay, you're currently feeding these 30 horses. Actually, you need 90 horses because you'd have shifts, okay? And actually, with a 30 horsepower engine, you can get rid of 90 horses, and you can see the guy would start going, ka-ching.
Wow.
Okay, I better get one of these steam engines. So that was the horsepower was a brilliant, brilliant marketing idea.
So, does that guy get credit for wattage and horsepower both?
Well, the watt they named after him in an homage, I think.
Wow.
So it's like the volt after Volta and everything else. But no, he's pretty good in a sense. He created one unit of power and had another one named after him, which is pretty good. Deserved it, actually, because, as a total sort of genius coming from absolutely nowhere, pretty humble beginnings, it was a pretty amazing achievement, it has to be said.
Yeah. One thing that's so interesting to me about you in general is that you are one part's conservative. You've described yourself as conservative, but one part's incredibly open. And I feel as if that combination we don't see enough. If you think of somebody conservative, they're likely going to be closed off to new technologies and ideas. And if you look at somebody open, they're unlikely to be conservative. So do you notice that too within yourself?
No, I think a respect for conservatism, because conservatism at its best respects things that are the product of time,
mm-hmm.
okay, which may not have a single author, which may not even make sense, but which probably have some virtue just by dint of their continued existence.
Yeah.
Okay. So there is a guy, and I suppose I'm the only other one. He describes himself as the world's only evolutionary conservative or something. He's quite an interesting academic somewhere in the Midwest. He might call himself a Darwinian conservative or something. There's a thing called, Chesterton was a conservative thinker, and the Chesterton's fence, which I mention in the book, is this thing which, and Chesterton's rule is, if you find there's a fence somewhere, okay, and you say, I don't understand what this fence is for, your natural tendency is to pull it down. But until you know why someone built the fence in the first place, it's a crashing mistake to pull it down, because there was a reason for having that fence there at one time, and maybe it will serve some purpose again in the future. And you will see cases where people have abandoned sort of time-worn wisdom simply because they don't necessarily understand it. Okay. I mean, I think Dawkins is a complete moron when it comes to religion. I find it shameful. And interestingly, the other person who said the same thing was Higgs, the guy who won the Nobel Prize for predicting the Higgs boson. He said that he finds Dawkins embarrassing when he talks about religion. Because, of course, the question with religion is not only is it true, but does it serve some evolutionary value in terms of cooperation or collaboration for everybody to believe the same thing? After all, money is no different, right? Money doesn't only works because we all believe in it, okay? And because the cost of not believing it is very, very high. Okay, if you believe that money is worth,
and
okay, it's a very expensive belief to hold, even though it might be objectively accurate to say all these notes are utterly meaningless. And so these social constructs, it's completely wrong to assume that a belief that isn't strictly speaking true has no value. I mean, the belief in an afterlife or the belief there's an all-seeing deity may make it much easier for groups of people to behave in a collaborative, honest way to one another. That seems to be self-evident, okay? And so act as though this were true. It doesn't strike me as particularly crazy. And so, I mean, I also think that there are things where it's also worth noting, of course, that human perception is weird to begin with. And so this idea that we can we just had a conversation about it, the paceometer, okay? Whether you're told that your speed in miles per hour or you're told your speed in minutes per 10 miles, okay? Those two things are identical mathematically, okay? 10 minutes for 10 miles and 60 miles an hour are the same thing. But if your speedometer displays speed in one form, you will drive in a different way to if your speedometer displays speed in the other way around, even though mathematically one can be derived completely from the other.
Yeah.
Okay. And so how you present information to people has a bearing on what it means, because we're not scientific instruments. Okay. We don't perceive things in the same way that physicists measure them, to the point where there are things like magenta, which is a colour that doesn't exist in nature. This only exists in the brain. It's created by the brain to make sense of a red-blue colour combination in the absence of green. Okay?
So we can't find magenta anywhere in nature?
No. So there's no magenta light. It doesn't exist on the spectrum. What happens is that the brain, let me get this right. Okay, so if you show red and green, the brain, equal amounts of red and green light, okay? The brain goes, okay, well, I'm getting equal firing on the red and green bits here. Halfway between red and green is yellow, okay? So I'm going to see yellow, okay? And now yellow light does exist. Yellow is a colour on the spectrum. It's halfway between red and green. But magenta's a weird problem, because if the brain sees red and blue, halfway between red and blue is green. But we've got a sensor that detects green, and that's not picking up any green. So the brain says it can't be halfway between red and green, because if it were halfway between red and green, it would be green, and I'd be detecting green, right? Okay, so I have to invent a colour in my head to make up for the fact, to explain. Now, if our brains were, if you like, computers, they'd basically go, does not compute, and everything magenta would appear like fuzzy grey with system error written all over it, okay? But our brains don't do that. They just instead have just basically created a colour which is entirely a psychological perceptual construct.
Wow.
And in the same way, there are things out there that we don't see, and there are things we see that don't exist. Okay, so the idea that the way to get rational human behaviour is to provide humans with objectively accurate information is basically a non-starter, I think. That we need stories and we need metaphors and goodness knows what else to actually comprehend the world.
What makes for a good story?
Oh God, I mean, there are various things in this, which is that obviously there are people who claim there are only 7 basic plots. Okay, what seems to me the case is that stories, I always describe them, this is not great, by the way, but it's useful, as like the PDF files of human information. In other words, it takes information, puts it into a format, or you might argue one of 7 formats, okay, which is both storable, maybe compressible, storable, and shareable. And so there's something there, I think, where the story, there's a wonderful distinction, which is that the difference between 2 facts in a story is the king died and then the queen died, versus the king died, then the queen died of grief. Okay. And that one of them is effectively just 2 facts and the other one is a story. Yeah. And the second one is obviously much more resonant than the first. And it's a really interesting question. But I mean, I suppose, there is a belief, there's a book called The Case Against Reality, I think, by a guy called Don Hoffman, if I got that right. And he believes that effectively the way the brain presents the world to us is effectively a metaphor, exactly in the same way that a computer desktop, which has files, okay, and a dustbin, right, that's just a metaphor for what your computer's doing. And the reason you have a dustbin on your Mac, does it still have a bin on it, the Mac
I think
desktop?
so. Yeah.
Okay, right. I'll let you into a secret. It's not a real bin. There's no real bin there. There isn't a little man inside who scrumples things up and puts them in there. It's just a way of actually skeuomorphically representing a complex process in a way that's familiar to us because it resonates with our physical selves and with what we've already become accustomed to. Okay, and there's a school of thought which says that the brain effectively presents reality to us in the same way.
Wow.
It doesn't care, because his argument is evolution doesn't give a shit about accuracy, it only cares about fitness. And if the brain has to take a decision between, do I present this mug with accurate information, which might cause him to fall off a cliff, or useful information, which is not accurate but might cause him to avoid the cliff, okay, it's going to choose the second path every time, because the brains which chose the first path are no longer around to actually replicate.
Yeah. And this goes close to your idea of we deceive ourselves to begin with.
Yeah, that's Bob Trivers, that self-deception is an essential evolutionary function, because in order to deceive other people, or to disguise our intentions, or to solve oblique problems, if you like, we have to disguise our ultimate intent. And in order to do that, the best way to do that is for us. Okay, so you may say, if you were really cynical, I don't know if Trivers says this, that love is a way of basically disguising the fact that you want to have sex with somebody. Okay, because it wouldn't be a very, there are blokes who try it. The late JFK apparently was basically just went up and said, do you want to have sex?
Oh my God.
But broadly speaking, seduction is an aim best pursued obliquely. Okay, you show off, you do funny, if you're a bird, you do funny little dances, in other words, it's not something which you can persuade. In fact, the art of it precisely lies in concealing your ultimate intention. Yeah, if you like. And the best way to conceal your ultimate intention is for nature to disguise it from you yourself.
Scary world we're living in, almost like when you.
No. I know. I have to admit, I like you mentioned the fact that that if you hear these things, you never look at the world the same way. And the only thing that sometimes worries me is that not all of this stuff is necessarily good for mental health. But for mental health, I'm not even sure creativity is very good for mental health, to be absolutely honest. And that for mental health, sometimes, one reason why people are pretty conservative and have a cut and dried and very slightly constrained view of the world is it's probably a pretty comfortable way to be.
Interesting.
Actually. we all, I rather think that Darwin was prone to depression, okay? And you have to wonder, was it just because actually, you're all much happier believing that there's a guardian angel or deity who has some concern for your well-being?
Yeah, it's interesting because some people...
Rather than just being the product of kind of atomic indifference.
Yeah, some people go, nothing matters, and that's so freeing. Other people go, nothing matters, and I'm depressed because nothing matters. So it's like, how do you help people?
Yes, I know. It's a bit like that weird thing with parenting, which is if you tell people actually, there's not much you can do as a parent to make much difference. You can either go, okay, I've got to try incredibly hard to do the 5% that I really can do to make a difference to my parenting. Or you could say, as I think it's Brian Kaplan, who basically wrote a book, which it's not called this, but it says Stop Giving a Shit and Have a Load of Kids, is basically what the book's called, right? Okay. I must admit, when you look at the... one thing I was joking to my wife about is, that when you I had twins, so I never really had a second round of childbearing. I had 2 children simultaneously. And people do say by the time you get to child number 2 or child number 3, you do kind of realise that actually the fact that they have a temperature almost certainly doesn't mean they're going to die. The little buggers have an immune system that runs like a bloody train, And that is the amazing thing with kids. They get ill. Their temperature rocks up to some insane thing where you can boil an egg on their head, right? And then 7 hours later, they're fine, right? Wow. The same kind of thing that would knock me out at 56 for kind of 4 days. They deal within a few hours, but there is that dilemma, isn't there? Which is you can't make much difference. Oh, God, I have to work really hard at what I can do versus... okay, let's just chill about it.
Yeah. So how do you make that? And like, you have such a personality to me of like, it's all good. Whatever happens, happens. Like you have a very relaxed in a way personality from, listen, was that a true to you?
No, I'm a bit neurotic.
Really?
Weirdly about small things. So oddly, if I actually crashed a car, I'd be relatively calm.
Interesting. But
if I were in a situation where I thought the car might crash or might not crash, I'd be very panicky.
That's like you don't know if it's true or not. You don't.
Yeah. So I react very, very badly to uncertainty. I really, really dislike uncertainty.
Like getting stuck in a jail. Some might say.
Or loss of autonomy, I guess, is the thing, probably. But I mean, equally, I'm fairly good with accommodating contradictions and actually, I often think that part of the reason social media is problematic is because it's disproportionately young. Okay? And one of the things that I notice about older people, one of the things I think that creative people have a little bit is, and John Cleese writes about this in his excellent book, Creativity, A Short and Cheerful Guide, which is they're comfortable with ambiguity. They're comfortable playing and toying with uncertainty. And one thing I do worry about a bit about the young is that quite a lot of tweets should say, actually, Trump was a grotesque narcissist and so on and so on, but he had some good points. Okay?
Yeah.
Right? Or, look, I'm generally massively in favour of a high degree of sympathy to asylum seekers, but you can't have unlimited immigration. And therefore someone needs to tackle this problem because practically, not necessarily the question of numbers, just the question of speed, right? Okay? You can't have 150 million people turning up in a country in the space of a year, okay? It's just, it just doesn't, it doesn't work.
Nuance.
Right?
Nuance is lost in social media.
Also, but you're not allowed to say "but" in tweets. And in fact, it's a very boring thing to do. I jokingly said I was wondering about having so my interesting question was, if you made it compulsory on social media, okay, that everybody, every time they tweeted, they had to tweet a moderate opinion. Okay. Now, we've got a guy, you probably remember him, called Piers Morgan.
Yes.
Okay. And he's massively polarising. Okay. Now, my 56-year-old view of Piers Morgan is that he's really quite entertaining in small doses. I wouldn't want to live with a guy. I wouldn't want to flat share with a guy. I wouldn't necessarily want to go on a 20-hour flight with a guy. But in small doses, I find a bit of Piers Morgan quite entertaining, quite enjoyable. He says things other people wouldn't say. Well, that's the point of having the guy on TV. If you're only saying things that everybody else says, well, what the hell's the point, right? I can kind of live. I can live in a universe where Piers Morgan exists. Okay, it's not. These things are not impossible. And I think there's a weird thing which I think probably comes out of the huge expansion of further education, where people want to generalise, and as a result they oversimplify. Because it all comes down to, do you want to be? I suppose okay. If you look at really interesting people like Shakespeare, it's patently clear that Shakespeare has characters who are both good and bad, okay? And Shakespeare kind of accepts the fact that the world is always going to be populated with a lot of those characters, and actually, in aggregate, it makes it a kind of interesting and, not always pleasant or unviolent, but it makes it, it makes it what it is, okay? I hate to use that phrase, it is what it is, right? As Shakespeare said, it is what it is. But interesting nuanced positions on things aren't totally oversimplified. And yet it's completely weird. If I ever, something occurred to me that if I ever tweeted, actually I find Piers Morgan quite enjoyable in small doses, people wouldn't know what to make of that. No one would retweet it, okay? No one would like it. So I think there's this experiment. I think there's this great experiment with bland Twitter.
Interesting.
Where people actually just go and say, I think Trump had some good points, but on the whole, I think he, not sure Putin would have invaded the Ukraine if Trump had still been in the White House, but...
Imagine a Twitter where it's like nuance.twitter.com, where all you go on is for nuanced takes that people have.
I mean, the great one would be nature nurture, wouldn't it? Which is a bit of a weird one because, okay, no one on the nature side, certainly not me, suggests that nurture has no bearing or that peer groups have no bearing. And I've spent a basic lifetime saying context really matters.
Yes,
okay?
yes.
I'm not going to suggest that that context is irrelevant to human behaviour, because I basically bet the farm on the opposite, right? That context has a huge bearing on how we perceive, therefore how we feel, therefore how we act.
Yep.
But at the same time, there's some genetic influence at work. It's kicking around. There's some aspects of personality or temperament, particularly having two non-identical twins, by the way. It's pretty hard to believe there isn't some, okay. And these two non-identical twins who are very, very different in many, many ways.
It's like,
okay,
50% of U.S. presidents they lost a parent in their first 18 years of their life. So I don't know if that's just
Now, you see, interestingly, it may be one of those things where it's there are certain things, by the way, like losing a parent, which tend to increase the variance of outcome.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, measuring U.S. parents, funnily enough, I think that's true of my... you won't believe this, but something like my fourth cousin twice removed is Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, I know. Woodrow Wilson's your eighth cousin.
It's something. It's totally obscure. He came back. He came back on a cycling holiday. This is while he was at Princeton, before he was president or even governor of New Jersey. He came back on some cycling holiday through both Carlisle and Dumfries, looking for his ancestors.
Wow.
See, which were my ancestors, but by that time the Dumfries ones had pissed off to Wales.
Wow!
So they were down in Wales running a shop, so they never knew that there was a future U.S. president pottering around Dumfries trying to track them down. Anyway,
no 23andMe back then.
Yeah, but no, it interests me because there are probably certain traumatic life events. Dyslexia seems to be probably a little bit of a kind of variance game, so that you're more likely to be particularly successful, but on average you may do worse, but the variance goes up. And I can imagine I mean, the one that does frighten me is, and it interests me because, of course, the extent to which you can now blame people is the number of serial killers who seem to have had some sort of prefrontal brain injury in early life.
Wow.
Now, okay, there may be now, because it became widely known, there may be a degree of kind of self-selection going on where every time there's a serial killer, someone says, can you tell me of a time he fell off a swing or, whatever, so then... I don't know what we may be suffering from base rate neglect in that lots of people have these minor accidents.
Yeah.
But it does look interesting if you look at Ed Gein and Fred West and Dennis Nielsen. I've got a vague memory, but you go and look through a series of serial killers and the number of them who, because we've got to remember, of course, that actually in an age of things like no safety glass in cars, motorbike riding without helmets. Actually fairly nasty domestic violence, but also kids doing really dangerous shit.
Yeah.
That might have been just more common.
Yeah.
But no, that's an interesting one about the presidents. I'd never heard that before.
Yeah. Well,
Ronald Reagan's dad died young, didn't he? I think, or pissed off, or either just disappeared. But isn't that interesting?
Yeah. I don't know what to make of that, but the variants definitely make sense to me. And, on the topic of, you had this great thing about American belief, which is we have this idea that life is capable of continuous improvement. And I just thought that's such a fascinating way to frame it. And it's so true if you think about it in an overall arching context.
Compared to British, because Brits and Americans in many respects pretty similar, but there's a negativity to Brits or a cynicism.
Yeah.
Which... now, I think Americans overall, in aggregate, possibly benefit from this. This is where we can get down to the religion thing.
Yeah.
Which is it true? No, I don't think it's true. Okay. Is it individually beneficial and is it collectively beneficial?
Interesting.
And I think Americans collectively benefit from the optimism of other Americans because other Americans try things. And the optimism of American consumers, by the way, who are... historically, much, much readier, because they believe their lives are capable of continuous improvement, are much more ready to try out new stuff.
Yeah.
Whether it's some weird thing on the shopping channel or whatever, they're much readier to try new ways of doing things than say, French people are. Brits are kind of halfway in between, I think. On that. French are very weird because they're either incredibly innovative or inventive or unbelievably conservative. I mean, there are certain aspects, if you tried to improve on a French continental breakfast, they'd hound you out of the country, if you tried to change anything like that. But at the same time, they invent extraordinary things sometimes.
That must cause really quite a crabs in a bucket mentality of where you have some crabs trying to reach the top and others like, get back down here. You're not meant to.
Get that down. Yeah. What the hell are you doing escaping this bucket? But it's it's very interesting in the sense that I suppose the Japanese are fantastic in that case, aren't they? That they're both incredibly inventive, but there's certain aspects of Japanese culture which are kind of absolutely set in stone. There's a wonderful example of the woman who wrote, I think it was it The Paradox of Choice? No, it wasn't. That's Barry Schwartz. There's a woman who wrote an interesting book about choice.
Annie Duke
is Indian.
Oh no.
No, she's very interesting as well, by the way. But she's Indian, and she went to Japan and said, I'd like a green tea. I think it was a green tea, but I'd like some sugar in it. Now, and they said, no, you don't have sugar in green tea. She said, no, I know you don't traditionally have sugar in green tea, but I'm Indian, and they have sugar in tea much more often, and I just like really sweet tea. And so that's what I like, is green tea with sugar in it. And basically the place wouldn't serve it.
Wow.
Because that's just not what it's just not that's not as far as they're concerned, that's not a thing. And but it is kind of fascinating because one thing it undoubtedly it does is that more people try more things, and ultimately you end up getting lucky more often. Okay, but I think there is an individual price paid, one of which is the assumption that people who haven't made it are failures.
Interesting.
So, loser in the United States tends to be an insult, whereas in the UK it's a kind of term of affection.
Actually?
You must meet my mate Dave. He's a bit of a loser, but he's a great guy, right? It's kind of because, there are forces beyond your control. It's not reasonable to think that anybody can make it. You know, if you know, okay, let's look at Bill Gates, right? Bill Gates, wonderful guy, incredibly bright guy, very hardworking. No, not denigrating the guy in the slightest, okay? But he happens to go to the one high school in Seattle, which freakishly in 1970 something is leasing mainframe time from some nearby company, so the students can get onto the mainframe, right?
Yeah.
Now, my school, you know, was quite a perfectly wealthy school. I wasn't, you know, I'm not claiming right, okay. But in like 1982 or 1981, we got some piece of shit computer that then cost the price of a car, right? Okay.
Yeah.
But Gates was getting this mainframe time in like I'm not sure it wasn't, how old is he now? I guess it would have been the 70s he was at high school. Early 70s, okay. That was just unheard of in 90%, you know, for 99% of the world's population. Right? Now, I'm not saying the guy squandered the opportunity, because blatantly he didn't, okay? And he's a fantastic guy, and he's, you know, all that sort of stuff. But equally, not everybody could have done that.
Yeah.
You know, even blessed with the same natural advantages. You know, and there's an element of luck. And by the way, I mean, you know, there's an element of actually, you know, as Nassim Taleb would say, and probably Annie Duke would say, the skill there is not pretending to know what the future is. The skill is exposing yourself to the chance of getting lucky.
Yes, that's the point about fame.
You know,
how fame increases your odds of a random good thing happening to you.
Because there's a whole lot of stuff you don't know. And if you're famous, which means that people know you, people will come to you with information or opportunities that you could never have found out, not least because you didn't know they existed. Okay? Right? So, I mean, you'll never know who all your customers are. You'll never know who all your potential customers are. Okay? You'll never know every single good idea that you can have with a particular product. You don't know the people who might be able to solve your problem. But if a lot of people have heard of you, there's a chance that someone will come and tell you.
Yeah.
And exploiting that basic asymmetry seems to be quite an important function of advertising. You know, apart from the psychological thing that we're all happier buying things we're familiar with anyway. But making yourself lucky rather than exploiting what you already know seems to me an important distinction. Now, I'm not saying you don't do the second. You do need to, if you know something, obviously make use of it. But at the same time, acknowledge what you don't know and try and expose yourself to mechanisms which might actually fill in the holes in your knowledge.
Yeah.
And making yourself famous seems to be a pretty good way of doing it.
On the point,
let's not forget. Okay, I was given a brilliant lesson in this, which is after my book had come out, maybe it had been out a couple of months. I get invited completely by accident. I happen to be in Cannes. A famous British broadcaster called Chris Evans is broadcasting his Virgin radio show from Cannes. It has about 500,000 listeners, I'd guess.
Wow.
Okay, and he interviews me a bit about the book. And I go off, and I think that went quite well, and that was nice. What I didn't realise is that evening, Chris Evans finished reading the book. Because he'd only read about half. I don't blame him, because, I mean, he'd only heard about the book about 2 hours beforehand. And he finished reading the book on the beach, and he spent the next day's show basically talking about my book. Okay? Anyway, I couldn't understand what the hell was going on, because the sales figures in Amazon for that day and for the next 3 or 4 days went... I was outselling J.K. Rowling.
Oh, my God. How many sales, if you don't mind me asking?
I can't remember the volume sales. All I was looking at was the rankings. And the rankings were... I don't think I ever made it to number 1 quite in the overall bestsellers chart. But I think I got into the top 10. That's
so fascinating that you were looking at the ranking and not the sales, because you were looking at the comparative performance compared to somebody else rather than the sum total, which is just a fascinating insight as well.
All I knew was the only thing that was outselling me was I think the only thing outselling me at one point were cookery books, which always apparently, unless you have a new J.K. Rowling out, apparently cookbooks, you know,
thousands or tens of thousands of sales.
It's gift giving, birthday present shit. You see. Yeah, so it's very difficult to compete with cookbooks because people don't generally buy non-fiction as a present, whereas they buy cookery books and biographies as presents.
Right.
And so I was pretty happy. But I suddenly realised, you know, the people who bought that book were how many ever thousand, 15, 20,000 people maybe, is enough to get you that high in Amazon in a day. But there were 20,000 people I never would have heard of. And the other thing with the book is it was popular with audiences I never anticipated, like the investor community. And, I thought bankers and general, what I saw as left-brain people would hate the book. But they were, I kept getting speaking invitations from kind of, venture capital firms, goodness knows what else.
So so
that's also good.
Is this a case against the great thing niche? About?
Yeah. I mean, there are, you can't. I mean, the niche. As Jeremy Bulmer said, a niche is ultimately a small hole in a wall, and you can inhabit it, but you're not going to thrive there. And actually, I buy that Byron Sharp thing that actually, most people are repertoire buyers, and that in order to enjoy brand strength, you have to sell to a lot of people infrequently, as well as selling to some people very frequently. There are a few. I would argue with Byron, talking to this neuroscientist, he said there are a couple of brands, and I'd say Tesla and Apple are two of them, which weirdly effectively get caught up in people's actual identity. Okay, so this guy said, the neuroscientist from Penn said, effectively, Samsung people are people who like high-end phones and like the feel of the phone, but don't want to join the cult of Apple because they find it a bit weird. Okay, Apple people would regard the sacrifice of an Apple device for a Samsung device as basically striking at their very being. Now, being blunt, that's probably not true of even, say, Tide, right? I'm guessing you buy Tide. I mean, it's a slight anomaly, isn't it, the market penetration? Okay? But, I mean, if you had to buy some other washing thing, it would be a mild inconvenience and an annoyance, but you wouldn't feel that your identity had been destroyed. But, of course, it's worth noting that cars and mobile phones, those brands have, as you pointed out, they're both dominated by a kind of evangelist founder figure, and they're both consumed in a very public place. Never forget, of course, that Apple never really got dominance in the desktop market, did it?
Interesting.
Apple enjoyed enormous dominance in things you carry around and wave in the faces of other people, such as iPods, those funny earphone things,
AirPods,
and that's you can tell I'm not in the ecosystem. I am a Samsung guy, and I'm very fond of the Pixel phone actually as well. But actually, you could argue there's a kind of fashion tribal thing going on there, which is quite anomalous, really. And it's not reasonable for most brands to aspire to that. Sorry, but it isn't.
But do you think that is where an opportunity exists for brands to come in? Imagine, for instance, there was a Tide or a laundry detergent company that had an evangelist or a personal brand, and I felt connected to that person. So then I'm more likely to spread that message to other people. Does that indicate a room for possible?
It was a very shrewd advertising agency strategy to make your marketing director the hero of the advertising, not least because it would make the guy impossible to fire. Which would mean you wouldn't have to repitch for the business every 3 years. But it's interesting. It's one of the problems I think we have is that outside the Musks and the Jobs and so forth of this world, the typical CEO is vastly more practiced in talking to investors and the financial community than in talking to customers.
Which is similar to a political campaign in politics, how the people in politics only want to convince other people in politics about the things that are important to them, not the people who are potentially voters.
No, absolutely, yeah. It's interesting, though, isn't it? Which is that why so few... We've had a few. We had Ogilvy, famously. This is years ago now. Had a guy who was a Norfolk turkey farmer come in called Bernard Matthews, and he wanted to sell his turkeys, right? Now, I'm doing a West Country accent because I can't do a Norfolk accent. He had a fantastic, although he was, multi-millionaire, I mean, immensely rich man, a bit like, I imagine Frank Perdue or one of those guys. He was still a genuine kind of farmer type in his accent and his dress and his deportment. Okay. And Ogilvy, quite rightly, in London, said, you should be the face of the advertising. Because, you know, if we want the honest impression of Norfolk turkey farming, you're the guy. BBH did it latterly with Yo Valley, where they actually featured the farmers, the family who actually own Yo Valley, which makes yogurt and dairy products and organic milk and so forth. The daughter of the farming family became a kind of pin-up among a niche audience, I think. But actually, there's a famous rhyme that says, okay, if your client grows refractory, show a picture of his factory. Only in the direst cases ever show your clients' faces. But actually, I'm not sure where that rhyme comes from, because the honesty of saying, here I am and I have reputational skin in the game, you know, because we all knew that the reason Apple products were good would be that Jobs would actually rather commit ritual seppuku than ship a bad product. As indeed happened when 4 days before the launch of the first iPhone, he decided that the prototype in his pocket was getting scratched by his keys. Strikes me as fairly fucking negligent, keeping your keys in the same pocket as your phone. Steve, get a fucking grip, right? But nonetheless, Steve, for some reason, kept his car keys or something in the same pocket of this plastic phone. Okay, and about 4 days before they're about to press go on mass manufacturing, Jobs just goes, these scratches are no good. We need this Gorilla Glass. So he gets on to Corning, and there's this huge shipment of this Gorilla Glass gets sent out to Shenzhen, okay, to Foxconn. Now, the slightly unattractive element of that is it arrives at 1 o'clock in the morning, the first shipment, and apparently people went through all the factory dormitories just waking everybody up in the middle of the bloody night and making them come and manufacture the phones, okay? So, all your flaming woke Apple users, you know, I think you ought to be a little bit conscious of that. But nonetheless, you know, I mean, you know from Jobs's skin in the game thing that it would have been a source of reputational absolute pain and humiliation.
Yeah.
You know, and that, you know, and also you felt the focus was on the customer, not on the bloody shareholder.
Yeah.
Actually, when he's listened to shareholders, it's gone badly wrong, like the Apple 5C. You know, shareholders were always saying you need to produce a lower cost version. Failing to realise, of course, that the low-cost version of an iPhone is a second-hand iPhone. That it's much higher status to have an iPhone that was the best iPhone 3 years ago than to have a brand new iPhone which says, I'm not a proper iPhone.
Yeah, that's a part of your book, which is great. Rory, we're wrapping up here on time. I could literally talk to you for days at a time, and I hope we do get the chance in the future to do it again. This was
I'd be joy. Yeah,
enormous
really
amount of fun.
anytime.
Enormous amount of fun.
It's about a joy. And, of course, we all know, because it's Riverside, that we have to stay on until it's uploaded to 100%.
Yes, where can we send people to connect with you?
What happened? Why did Riverside? Because there was that previous podcasting tool that an academic developed. Riverside FM seems to have taken over, doesn't it, as the default the podcast software du jour.
They have really done well, and I see Rory Sutherland too means you've been in here before. But I think it's because of the design and just the ease of use. Yeah. But where can we send people to connect with you further?
Twitter, always the best place, at Rory Sutherland, all one word, RORYSUTH as in Kiefer. That's where the resemblance ends. Friend of mine met Kiefer Sutherland, by the way. I was delighted to say he was an absolutely lovely guy.
Wonderful.
So he said it was rather lovely because he had a phone conversation with Kiefer actually, and at the beginning he said, "I have to blame you a little bit because when my first child was a baby, we used to neglect the child completely while staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning watching episodes of 24."
Incredible show.
At the very end of the phone call, beautiful, amazing show. And at the very end of the show, Kiefer, having just the phone call, Kiefer having discussed loads of other things in the interim, just ends with, "And pass on my apologies to your son."
That's great.
So good to know the. But I like that actually. I think those cases of celebrity non-arseholery. Of course, he's Canadian, which helps, doesn't it? because Canadians have there's that slight thing of pull the crab back.
Well, it's so interesting. Whenever somebody meets a celebrity, what's the first question that we ask? Was he nice? Was she nice?
Yeah.
Why is that our first question?
It's interesting because I suppose it's so common that they aren't. And in defence, it's pretty damn difficult. If you get that volume of attention which superstars must get, not occasionally brushing people off or being a bit brusque or abrupt. Who was the famous guy who really, really reacted badly to autographs, where he literally just fuck off? But it must be pretty tiring. But equally, there are people. Tom Cruise, I've always heard it said of, and fun enough, Clooney. Who everybody who's bumped into them, and they're rock stars, musicians as well. Musicians, of course, in many cases have had it tough.
Interesting.
So that's sometimes true of actors as well. But that is an interesting question. Yeah, were they nice? And it must be bloody awful having to appear, because it's not enough to. You are judged by unrealistic standards of niceness, aren't you? Probably.
Yeah. Every time you have to do another picture, say
but
hello to one.
It's the old thing, which is that manners are the things you don't have to do.
Interesting.
And I suppose that measure of I'll always give you a really good tip. The only time I've ever seen anybody on stage lose the crowd and absolutely lose all public support at a conference was when someone attacked the AV guy. So not physically, okay. This wasn't the kind of Will Smith incident,
yeah.
But no, he the slides weren't moving onwards, and he kind of shouted at the AV guy. And that business of kind of punching down. So the interesting thing is that there's that distinction, I suppose, in high status people, which is that are they nice to people they don't have to be nice? There's a quote about this. Who the hell is it? It's not Dickens. Who the hell is it? It's somebody like that. Which is, oh God, the mark of civilization is the extent of being nice to people when you don't have to be nice to.
Wow.
And I suppose the idea is that interesting distinction. And I think there are politicians who, in a sense, probably lose on that score. There's a quality, I think, in an American politician, which is, would you fancy having a pint with them?
Yeah, that's why Trump won, probably.
And actually, I'll say a weird thing, funnily enough. This is me being reasonable again. Nigel Farage, who was very famously the kind of part of the architect of Brexit in the UK. And I met him a couple of times. And one thing he does have, which I'll credit him with, is, I've been at dinners where, there are comparatively totally unimportant people like me, and there are really, really important people at the dinner, okay? And Farage chats away amicably with no distinction.
Yeah.
According to the importance of the people he's talking to. Now, there are other people who would basically, they would ration their attention in direct proportion to the power wielded by, the people at the table.
Yeah.
Or they would be looking over your shoulder while you were talking to them. But actually one quality which I think served him very, very well on the campaign trail was basically he was totally happy just yakking away to anybody.
Yeah.
He's a bit of a boozer, which may help, because, actually, I suppose, that may give you quite a lot of practice.
Yeah.
But who knows? I always thought that was actually a likeable characteristic.
The ability to show that every person is important and every person is worth your time and attention.
Hey, you kind of felt that about, in fairness to him, you kind of felt that about George W. Bush, didn't you? That he kind of, that he would actually, the one thing I miss of Trump, actually, which I thought he did. So one of the people I was talking to, the one group of people who all predicted the Trump victory first time round were primatologists.
Primatologists.
And everybody was saying to them that there's no way that this guy's going to win. And all the primatologists who spent their time basically studying humans as chimps went, yeah, he's going to win.
Yeah, marketing people had it spot on.
Yeah, marketing people often got it because they spotted the fact that he was a brilliant, brilliant marketer.
Yeah.
Okay. But the other thing he did, which nobody else has ever done, as far as Saddam Hussein probably had journalists killed, right? But Trump slapping down journalists, right? And basically, he'd start off by ridiculing their falling ratings or by going, fake news, next question, move on. Not interested. Now, to about 200 million people in America, right? Okay, Trump is, even if you don't like him, he's kind of the silverback gorilla. He's the kind of alpha male, right? He is the elected representative of a country of, 300 and something million people, right? And he's the boss guy. Now, these journalists are just some twat who's come out of Yale with a political science degree like 7 years earlier and basically stands in front of a building and talks to a camera, okay? And to most people, not everybody, but to most people, there is a correct order of things, and those people should actually treat the elected representative with a modicum of token respect. It doesn't have to be absolute respect. It doesn't have to be obeisance or it doesn't have to be subordination, nothing like that. But there should be a token of respect. And the idea of journalists just basically mouthing back to a president, I think was deeply uncomfortable, and has been in the UK to an extent, deeply uncomfortable, the extent to which it goes on. And I think a load of people, when Trump just basically swatted them back, as if they were kind of annoying baby chimp who was trying to steal some coconut. I thought that played really well. I thought he was incredibly smart to do it, and I'm amazed that nobody else has done it.
Well, maybe it'll be done in the future.
But it was very, very clever indeed.
Yeah. Well, okay. This gives us a lot to talk about for our round two, Rory.
So I will wait for it to upload now to 100%, because I know Riverside well enough.